In the Middle Ages, what was daily life really like for a peasant? How did they endure the backbreaking labour, harsh living conditions, and constant uncertainty about their next meal? With rigid social hierarchies in place, did they have any hope of improving their lives? For medieval peasants, life was more than just hard work. It was a relentless struggle for survival, with little chance of escape. Imagine standing in a medieval village, the air thick with smoke from cooking fires, the ground muddy from countless footsteps. Around you, people labour from dawn to dusk, bent over fields or crafting goods in dim huts. But not all of them are equal. In fact, medieval society was a finely tuned machine of hierarchy and obligation, where everyone knew their place, and moving up the ladder was almost impossible. At the top, of course, were the nobles, landowners with wealth and power passed down through generations. They ruled over vast estates and lived off the labour of those beneath them. Below them were the peasants, the vast majority who worked the land. And here's where it gets interesting. Not all peasants were the same. Some were free peasants, farmers who rented or even owned small plots of land. They paid taxes or rent, but were free to come and go, marry whom they pleased, and even sell their land, if they could find a buyer. They were tied economically, but not legally, to the land. Peasants owed a significant portion of their produce to their lords. Typically, they were required to give between 20 and 50% of their harvest as rent or feudal dues. The exact percentage varied depending on local customs, the generosity, or greed, of the lord, and the fertility of the land. But this wasn't just a simple transaction. It was a binding obligation that kept peasants tied to the land. Even in years of poor harvest, they still owed the same amount, often leaving them with barely enough to survive. In addition to backbreaking work on their land, they were also required to work on the lord's land. Look at it from the noble's perspective. Why pay for additional help when you can drag your own peasants from their land and work on yours? And if you're busy during planting or harvest season, and the lord comes calling, well, tough luck. Oh, and you weren't paid for this extra work either. Well, it could be worse. You could be a serf. They weren't slaves, but they weren't free either. They were legally bound to the lord's estate, unable to leave without permission. Born into their status, they couldn't marry or inherit property without the lord's consent. If the land was sold, they went with it, like fixtures attached to the soil. Unlike slaves, they couldn't be bought or sold as individuals, giving them a peculiar mix of rights and restrictions. Okay, so you managed to keep, let's say, half of your grain or wool after paying the lord. You can keep the rest, right? Wrong. Peasants had to pay another 10% to the church. This wasn't just an act of charity or faith. It was mandatory, enforced by both religious duty and social pressure. Refusing to pay wasn't just a sin. It was a serious offence, one that could lead to excommunication or social exile. And the payment was owed regardless of harvest conditions. If the crops were bountiful, the church received a generous portion. But if a drought or blight devastated the fields, the donation was still due. Peasants sometimes faced the cruel choice of feeding their families or fulfilling their religious obligation. The church used these payments, or tithes, to maintain buildings, support the clergy, and help the poor. But not all of it stayed local. Some of the wealth was funneled to distant monasteries or even to Rome itself. Peasants worked from sunup to sundown, breaking their backs in fields of wheat, barley, and oats. And it wasn't just hard labour that defined their days. It was also uncertainty. A single bad harvest could mean starvation. They relied on ancient communal traditions like shared tools and crop rotation to hedge against disaster. Meals were simple: bread, broth, and occasionally some cheese. Even this meagre diet depended on good fortune and weather. They supplemented it by foraging in the woods, gathering nuts, berries, and edible plants, skills passed down through generations. Over time, peasants, both free and serfs, had had enough of being exploited. After the chaos of the Black Death in the late 14th century, labour was more scarce, and as a result, in more demand. Workers demanded higher wages, but nobles passed laws to keep wages down and keep the peasants in their place. And when faced with an unpopular poll tax in England, the peasants' revolt kicked off. In 1381, the peasants marched on London. They weren't just fighting against taxes, they were challenging the entire social order. They demanded the end of serfdom, fair wages, and justice for all. But this wasn't just a mob. It was an organized movement, with a message that resonated across the kingdom. The revolt spread like wildfire. King Richard II even agreed to their demands, then quickly changed his mind. The leaders were executed, and that was that. Other peasant revolts occurred throughout Europe, but each time there was the same result. Those in power made promises, then changed their minds, and the poor continued to live unhappily ever after. Funny how some things don't change. The heavy burden of peasant life meant that they rarely saw the full benefit of their hard work. But they had no legal right to the land they farmed, so refusing to pay or work wasn't an option. They remained trapped in a cycle of dependency and poverty, with little hope of improving their lot. This system maintained the wealth and power of the nobility, but it also sowed the seeds of discontent that would eventually contribute to social unrest and revolts. While the feudal system was designed to be stable and orderly, it was also inherently fragile, resting on the backs of those who had the least.